Welcome to the 60s DJ channel where we dive into the sounds, stories, and legends of the grooviest decade in music history. Today we've got something truly special for all you Beatle fans out there. Joining me on the show is the world-renowned Beatles historian, author, and executive producer of the documentary Looking for Lennon, David Bedford. From uncovering untold stories of the Fab Four to producing projects that keep their legacy alive, David's work is a treasure trove for fans and scholars alike. So settle in and let's dive into the magic of the Beatles with the one and only David Bedford. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. What an introduction. You write
Well,
all
it's
my intros.
such a big subject, it needs a big intro.
And a big mouth. I've got one of them.
So, David, what got you interested in the Beatles?
It's been my whole life, really. I grew up in the Dingle, which is where Ringo Starr's from.
Right.
And so Ringo Starr's birthplace is Madryn Street. And the bottom of Madryn Street, you turn left and you go along about 20 yards. That was my back gate. So I spent my first 24 years in the Dingle. I actually went to the school that Ringo had gone to. So his
Right.
primary school. So that started all that. And I lived around there. Even when I got married, we first lived 2 streets away from where he grew up. And then when we moved, we thought it's time to start a family. We came to this area here, which you might have heard of, which is called Penny Lane. And
So you
then,
live in Penny Lane?
yeah, just off Penny Lane. And the whole
Wow.
neighbourhood is known as the Penny Lane area. So we've lived down there for over 30 years. We've got 3 daughters. They were all born in the same hospital as John. And our local primary school is Dovedale, which is where both John Lennon and George Harrison went to school as well. So our daughters went to John and George's school. And for the last 20 years, I've been chair of governors at the school as well. So literally my whole life.
So it's intermingled there with the Beatles.
Yep. Yep. All the time.
So how did you go about researching your first book? What was it called? It's called Liverpool, isn't it?
Yeah, Liverpool, birthplace of the Beatles. So that all happened going back 25 years, summer of 2000. And it's weird how it all happens. And that's why the latest book is The Beatles What If, because for a big what if in my life, none of this would have happened if I hadn't fallen ill. So
Right.
I'd been working in insurance since I left school. I had a really good job. And then I got signed off work, long complications after a car accident, and eventually signed off work in June 2000 and never went back. And so at the age of 35, I basically was told, you're going to have to retire from work and you're going to have to find something to keep you going. So at 35, wife, mortgage, 3 young children, that was not exactly what you expect to hear. But because as parents, we got involved in our kids' school, it coincided with us receiving a sizable donation from Yoko Ono. We were
Right.
trying to work for the playground, and she was the one who responded to our
And is
appeal.
that, I take it that's the school that Ringo went to, was it?
It's the one that John and George went to.
Oh, John and George, right, got you.
Yeah. Dovedale Primary School.
Dovedale.
Yeah, and so because John had spoken fondly of his time at Dovedale, Yoko said he talked about that. He loved it there. I want to help you. How much money do you need? And we sent her the budget, which was about between 26, 27,000 pounds. And she said, right, well, I want to give you 30,000 pounds. Do all the work you want to do. Put some money in the pot, and then she made subsequent visits to the school. Quite a few of those. Made another donation in John's memory, and has invited the kids from the school to various events. One of which that I attended, and I actually met her with a group of the children from the school in Aunt Mimi's house where John had lived from the age of 5. And I have to say, she was absolutely wonderful with the children. She really was. And
Well,
so,
these are things that you don't often hear about Yoko Ono,
well, yeah,
these sort of things.
exactly. And I sort of thought, well, if she's doing this, that's not the woman that I've heard about who broke up the Beatles and all these evil stuff that she did. So one of the events that my wife and I organised was like a big school reunion. We just invited all former pupils of Dovedale to come to the school. Of course, this got national publicity because of the Beatles connection. And so over 600 former pupils turned up. And I met quite a few people who'd been at the school while John and George were there. So I was getting their stories from them. And one of the guys was writing his story for a Beatles fanzine Guy Stan Williams, he was in the year between John and George, knew them both. So he was writing some great stories, but he wasn't good with tech. So I said, look, I'm used to using the internet and everything. I'll send that down to the magazine for you. And I said to the editor, I said, look, would you be interested in a story about Yoko giving this money to the school? And he said, oh, yeah, definitely. So I wrote my first article about the Beatles. And that wouldn't have happened, and everything that's come since then, if I hadn't been signed off work. And basically, my doctor said, you've just got to find something to do with your
It's
brain.
always with the case that something bad always turns into something good, isn't it?
Well, that's it. And that's it. And so it was a massive moment in my life. And so eventually, it took another 12 months to be correctly diagnosed. I was misdiagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis in it originally. Finally diagnosed with a condition called fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain condition which gives you pain in every muscle, tendon, ligament, joints 24/7. So I've existed on a cocktail of tablets ever since. But it was my doctor who encouraged me, and he said, "Can you do more of that writing?" I said, "You've got to keep your brain active, as the body
Yep.
will be able to do less and less. Keep the brain active." So I thought, well, I've grown up with the Beatles all around me. I'll go and get a book on the Beatles and Liverpool, and maybe I'll go and photograph all the locations. And nobody had written a book just about the Beatles and Liverpool, which seems absolutely crazy.
That's strange, isn't it?
Yeah, since the year 2000, and nobody had done it. And so it sort of became my therapy, a little project, which was, well, I'm in Liverpool. I can just go and talk to people who were there at the time. So that started, I invited the original Quarrymen, John's first group, to come to the school in 2004 to do a concert. Uh, became friends
Did
with
you
them.
did you find that as a local yourself, you found that when you were talking to the people that knew that being a local actually helped you? Did you
Oh,
find that?
massively, massively, because all the books I was starting to read, they were writing about Liverpool and getting so much stuff wrong. And as I started talking to the people still in Liverpool, they were saying, "Oh, we're fed up a bit." One thing that Ringo often complained about was said, "They're writing about the Dingle as if it was the slums." He said, "I didn't grow up in the slums," and he didn't. The Dingle was just a nice working class area. It
Working
wasn't,
class?
yeah, it wasn't the slums at all. And Liverpool and Glasgow are very, very similar cities. Great
Absolutely,
port
yeah.
cities. You know, but trying to describe everywhere as working class as the slums is just so wrong. And that was
No, it's
just
just
one thing.
working class areas.
Exactly.
Exactly. There was everywhere in every city, you get working class areas, and
Yeah.
don't get me wrong, there was a lot of poverty,
Oh, no, absolutely right.
but they weren't slums. They weren't slums. So in your book, David, the Liverpool, your tagline is to understand the Beatles, you have to understand Liverpool. So we're going to take it back to the beginning, sort of before even the Beatles were a thing.
Yeah.
So what was Liverpool like? What was the music scene like there, and the clubs and things like that before the Beatles even, or when they were growing up, sort of thing?
It's been the part of the story that's always fascinated me.
I always
Well,
find that sorry to interrupt,
no,
but
no, no.
I always find like when I'm watching documentaries or movies on bands that I'm really interested up until they make it.
Exactly. Exactly. No, I
Yeah,
totally get
the
that. I'm
before
exactly the
thing
same.
is what I'm interested in.
Yeah, yeah. And I've spent so much time over the last 25 years trying to get to the bottom of all those different influences. And that's been reflected in the books that I've written. I've always tended to concentrate on those early years because it could only have happened in Liverpool.
Right.
I'd say a lot of similarities with Glasgow, uh, cosmopolitan port cities. Shipbuilding had been a massive part of our history. What we found with Liverpool was obviously skiffle music is what starts John. He starts his group, the Quarrymen, and I get asked it all the time. What is skiffle?
Right.
So dig into the origins of skiffle. That goes back to 1920s America, and quite often in the poorest areas. So again, we're talking working class people. Quite often in the black areas as well. If they were struggling to make the rent, then they'd throw a rent party, and they'd make their own instruments, invite friends and neighbours in, and just perform a load of songs. And then they pass the hat round, get the money, and they'd help to pay the rent.
So where did skiffle music come from? Is that from sort of roots music, Scottish
Yeah.
and Irish folk music?
I will get onto that in a moment because you get a good
Right.
mention for that. Don't you worry. Don't you worry. So skiffle, the first time skiffle ever appears is in the 1920s. There's a group called Dan Burley and the Skiffle Boys,
Right.
and they were playing what they consider like jug band music, other stuff from the Appalachians. A lot of it was banjos, guitars, and they would have like a bathtub, whereas we had a tea-chest bass, a
Yeah.
homemade upright bass, washboard, spoons, pans, all kinds of homemade instruments. It was great fun. And so Lonnie Donegan was a banjo player in a jazz group, the Chris Barber Jazz Group, and he got obsessed with American roots music, and he particularly then got into Woody Guthrie with the American folk music,
Right.
and a lot of this early stuff, Lead Belly, Huddie Ledbetter, a lot of those black blues singers as well. He lived in London, and what I found out, so a few years ago, I did a book called The Country of Liverpool, Nashville of the North, which was the country roots of Liverpool and the Beatles. And I discovered that Lonnie Donegan living in London would go into the American embassy, and within there they had part of the Library of Congress, and he was borrowing American records by these guys like Lead Belly and Woody Guthrie, etc., and learning those. So when the Chris Barber Jazz Band are playing, they were playing Dixieland jazz, which is everybody blowing trombones and trumpets non-stop,
Yeah.
all at the same time, chaotic stuff. But you can only do that for 45 minutes until your lips go numb. So they've had to take a break. So instead of losing the audience, Lonnie Donegan would bring on the guitar, Chris Barber a tea-chest bass, and Beryl Bryden a washboard, and they sing for about 15 or 20 minutes just some of these songs, these and all American songs, and then they'd resume again and off they go. So when the Chris Barber group are making an album in 1954 called New Orleans Joys, they were short of a couple of songs. So they said, well, let's throw on a couple of those skiffle songs we do in the interval. So they put on Rock Island Line and John Henry. So the end of 1955, Rock Island Line is released as a single. By January 56, it's in the top 10 of the hit parade, as it was called back then.
Right.
And suddenly, Donegan was saying to everybody, start your own group. No, up until that point, you could only get into a band really if you could read and write music and you learned a proper instrument. He was saying, learn 3 chords, here's 100 songs you can play. Thousands of groups sprang up all over Britain, and that's what became the skiffle revolution. So it's because
Wow.
of Lonnie Donegan that John, Paul, and George, amongst
Wow.
thousands of others, picked up guitars.
So it was all a Scotsman's fault.
Exactly right. You can claim him. I'll give you that. Yeah, because George Harrison said, no Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. And he's absolutely right.
No.
And so many of the big musicians who came through in the 60s, whether you're talking about Clapton, Jimmy Page, whoever, they thank Lonnie Donegan for what he did. They all acknowledge him.
Just how big was Lonnie? Like even over in America and stuff like that. Was he massive?
He did a tour over there, but it was a disaster because the musicians' unions in Britain and America,
Oh,
these
yeah.
reciprocal arrangements, and it was so hard to get over there because in Britain, after the silent movies had finished, all the musicians were out of work because they used to play along to the movies.
Yeah.
So the British Musicians Union said, we've got to protect our members' jobs. And they banned American jazz musicians from appearing in Britain.
Well, the,
But
the
that's the,
BBC had like a stranglehold on their bands and stuff like that for a long
oh,
time.
yeah, completely. So you had this
Yeah.
problem of not being able to swap musicians. So, but Lonnie Donegan was like one of the biggest selling artists, from 56 through to 59. Skiffle was the biggest thing. I think sales of guitars went from like 5,000 a year to 250,000 a year.
Five.
It,
Wow.
it was phenomenal. And Donegan started all of that. And that's just one part of the music. So we had skiffle in Liverpool, but then country music, which is how I got into that other book. because we had the biggest country and western scene in Britain, possibly in Europe, at the same time as beat music was taking off.
So how did that come about in Liverpool? Country and
So that
Western in Liverpool? How does that happen?
well, this is where you get your honourable mention because go back if you trace the roots of country music,
Right?
and the Americans will tell you, it came down from the Appalachians. But where did they get it from? The Ulster Scots.
The old
That's where they got it
hillbillies.
from. That's it. It was that British, the Irish, Scottish, Celtic music which went over to America, came down from the Appalachians and formed country music. So the roots of country music actually start over here.
So that was like the first British invasion then.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I
There
have
you
to try
go.
and convince them that, but no, it is true. That's how it
Yep,
started over here first. So we
yep,
had, of course, we had this huge Irish population because from the Great Famine onwards for the next few decades in the 1800s, 1.5 million Irish people passed through Liverpool.
yep.
Now,
On
a
the
lot
boats
of
and
them,
stuff.
yeah, a lot of them went off and populated the east coast of America and off into Canada. But we ended up with about 40,000 or more Irish people stayed in Liverpool. Now, that increased our population by 25%, which was a lot. So
Yeah,
I think we're known as the most Irish English city. So
yep.
we ended up with this big Irish population who, of course, bring all their music. So we had a lot of Irish folk music here. And therefore, out of that sort of grows country music as well. So there were loads and loads of country bands here. And by the 60s, in those early 60s, a lot of the country groups had to decide, are we going to follow the Beatles and stick to beat music? Are we going a mixture of the two or just go down the country route?
Go country route. Yep.
Yeah. And so a lot of them went country route. So a lot
So
of those gigs,
where were they playing this? What kind of venues were they playing? Sort of country and stuff like that back
well,
then.
again, me with my, when I get obsessed with these things. So like with Liverpool, I thought I want to find all the venues that the Beatles and the
Right.
Quarrymen played. And that I think comes about 110. Now, in total, by the time I did the country book, which kept me going in lockdown, I think we ended up with about 400 live music venues across Liverpool.
I thought you were going to say Britain.
No, no. I'm just really so the Merseyside
Just
area.
Liverpool.
That's all. Because I mean, now compare that to London. Our population now is what we're about 500,000 now. At
That's
most,
extraordinary.
we go to about 800,000 people at most mid 20th century. But we had live music on, and I've got the names of over 300 live bands who were performing just in this time at the end of the 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
You could go every night. There were church halls, village halls, town halls. There's music venues, illegal venues. I mean, there was all kinds going on here. This was a music city, and so you've got the skiffle music, you've got the country music, you've got the Irish music, and then of course we had the first transatlantic liners were going from Liverpool to
That's
Halifax,
right.
Nova Scotia, and then to New York. So we had what we called the Cunard Yanks. Now the Cunard Yanks, they were the Liverpool sailors who sailed on the Cunard and White Star Line ships over to New York. They got a few days in New York. They go and buy suits and cameras and big cigars, aftershave. Some of them actually affected an American accent. That's why they got the Cunard Yanks. But of course, they brought back records, and they were bringing
Right.
back blues, R&B, jazz, country, you name it. They were bringing it back. Everybody in any group anywhere across Liverpool knew at least one relative who was in the Merchant Navy. So records were coming into Liverpool, which weren't released in the country yet. So they're getting access to these. And then in, what was it, the second book I did called the Fab 104, I was looking at
Mhm.
all these different people who were part of the group or influenced them. I was talking to some of the guys in the Royal Caribbean Steel Band. So we had, I think we got the oldest black population in Britain was in Liverpool. Again, because we're a seafaring port. And we had this large Caribbean community. And we had this band in the Jacaranda Club called the Royal Caribbean Steel Band. And they were playing the steel pans. And they were led by
Right.
a guy. Yeah, exactly. Steel pans, all this calypso stuff that came
Yep.
from the Caribbean. A
God,
lot of these
such a
guys.
mix.
Oh, exactly. So you got these guys like Lord Woodbine, who came on the Windrush. He's
Right.
got this band in the Jacaranda. He becomes business manager with Alan Williams. Alan Williams and Lord Woodbine become the first managers of the Beatles in 1960. So
Right.
the Jacaranda was the place to be. John and Paul were obsessed with this steel band. They absolutely loved it. So Lord Woodbine then goes and introduces them to black musicians around Liverpool and the black clubs. They're then talking to not just the black Liverpudlians, but again, a unique aspect of Liverpool. In the Second World War, we had an RAF base just outside Liverpool called Burton Wood. That
Yep.
was taken over by the US Air Force in 1942, became the biggest operational air base in the Second World War. They had about
Uh-huh.
20,000 US servicemen based there. So all
20.
majority of the American soldiers, the tanks, the planes, everything that came into the war came in through Liverpool. So you got all these Americans out there. Well, by the 1960s, there's still thousands of them on the base, and the base was segregated because it was still
Right.
segregation in America. So the black guys from Burton Wood, these Americans, would go to the black clubs in Liverpool, and some of them would be musicians. Others would bring their records with them, and John and Paul are hanging out in the black clubs, and they were actually then talking to Americans. They were talking to these black American guys, and they were learning these obscure records which you wouldn't hear on the radio or anywhere else yet, because they brought them with them from America. So then they were learning a lot of R&B and a lot of blues, and they were being taught to play by the black musicians in Liverpool.
Right.
So you know that they've always talked about. You look at
Mm-hmm.
the Beatles' first albums where they're doing covers. How many of them are black Americans?
Chuck Berry and everybody like that.
Little Richard, yeah,
Little
all these
Richard.
guys, all these
Yep.
guys were a massive influence. That's where they were picking this up from because they were hanging out in the black clubs in Liverpool and they were learning all this from Americans. So what a
Wow.
melting pot to throw all of that in.
Absolutely. Wow. Wow. That's fascinating, David. Fascinating. So I'd like to go through each Beatle and talk about
Yep.
how their upbringing, if you like, David. So what was Paul's family life like, and before he was with the Beatles and stuff like that?
Yeah. So Paul's from a first generation Irish family. His mum was first generation Irish, Mary
Oh,
Moe.
Paul was as well. I knew John had Irish background, but I didn't know
Oh no,
Paul
all
was
four
as
of them
well.
have got Irish background.
Oh,
Um, And you'll like this as well. So the McCartneys, when they left Ireland, didn't come straight to Liverpool. They went to a city called Glasgow or something. I think it's called.
oh, I've never heard it.
Yeah,
Never heard
no.
it.
And then
No.
eventually they thought Glasgow's great, but
Thank
Liverpool's
God
really
they
nice.
left.
Yeah. So that's how the McCartneys end up down here. So they left
Right.
Ireland, Glasgow, and down to Liverpool.
They
So
couldn't build ships.
no, not very well. He worked in a cotton broker, did Jim McCartney,
Right.
because Jim, as well as working in the cotton brokers during the day, he was a really good pianist. He had his own band, a jazz band called Jim Max Band.
Right.
All his family were musical, so there's a piano in the house. So Paul taught himself to play piano by ear, and then Paul's first instrument was a trumpet,
Was it?
and yeah, he got given a trumpet for his 14th birthday because that's a good jazz instrument.
His dad probably got him it so he could play along with him.
Exactly, exactly. Because so many different members of the family played different instruments, so he could have
Yep.
joined a family band.
Yep.
Now, one of the tragedies for Paul was that they moved around Liverpool quite a bit with his mum's job. She was a district nurse and midwife. The house he then moved to when he was 13 in Forthin Road was the seventh house he'd lived in by the age of 13. Yeah, that's really unusual. But
That's
yeah,
not very stable.
no, but
No.
they're also in the area. But the last three moves had all been because Mary had gone back to work. Instead of going back as a nurse in a hospital, she wants to be a district nurse. So
Right.
that's what took her
As
to
you
that
you
house.
get you get then get sort of moved here, there, and everywhere into different districts. Then I take it.
Exactly, because the house goes with the job.
Yeah.
But 12 months after moving into that house when Paul's 14, his mum dies from breast cancer.
There you go.
Yeah, and of course,
There you
sad
go.
history repeats itself when he lost his wife Linda, also to breast
That's
cancer.
true. That's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
true. Never thought of that. Yep.
So it was a lot of Irish family traditions. There was always parties going on. Everybody had to sing their own song. So it was a great atmosphere to be in. 2 weeks after Mary died, Paul goes to see Lonnie Donegan in concert in Liverpool. He comes back and says, "Dad, can I have a guitar? Trade him a
There
trumpet."
you go.
What's his dad
Right.
going to say? And
That.
Paul's brother Mike says Paul lost a mum and gained a guitar because the next 3 or 4 months he just shuts himself away, doesn't communicate much, and concentrates on learning the guitar.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what about John? What was his upbringing like then?
How long have you got?
As long as you like.
It is such a complicated one. That's part of it with the documentary you mentioned, Looking for Lennon.
Uh-huh.
That really is what we were looking to find out. It was looking at pre-fame John, and my role was then as historian with all the people that I'd got to know, was then to introduce them to the director and the producer, and so we could make the film and do the interviews. So John's family was chaotic. Now some of it, there's so much myth around it, it's ridiculous. His dad
Well,
Alf,
this is where you can come in because you're the local guy
exactly.
on the scene, and you can gain the trust of all these people because you're a local, and you're probably going to tell us some great stories.
Well, that's it, and that's what helps of being here and gaining people's trust. Then they would then
Yep.
talk to him. So speaking to various members of John's family, are trying to get the record straight. So one myth that Alf, his dad, ran away and abandoned John. Well, actually, for 3 years, Alf was on the merchant navy ships crossing the Atlantic, trying not to be sunk by a U-boat, trying to
Right.
bring supplies in to keep Britain going. So that, to me, is quite a reasonable excuse for not being around very much.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
A pretty
Um,
honourable way of being missing.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
But then he does then go missing, and he did make some stupid mistakes because on when he's in New York, he's due to come back on a ship at a lower rating, and he said, "Well, I'm not doing that. I'm a head steward now.
Right.
I'll wait for the next ship." But it didn't work like that with the merchant navy. So he was saying, "Well, if you don't want it, then you're out." And suddenly he's stuck in New York with no ship, no money coming home, no communication with home, and it's during the Second World War. And Julia, for all she knows, Alf's dead.
Oh wow.
It takes him months and months to jump on other ships to eventually get back to Liverpool. By then, Julia has, John's mum, has had a relationship with a soldier, got pregnant. Alf turns up. Obviously, he's quite good at sums, realizes it's not his.
Yep.
Speaks to the soldier. They go and confront Julia. Julia doesn't want anything to do with the soldier. And Alf says, "Well, if we stay together, I'll bring the child up as my own." But by then, Julia's moved on. She's had enough of Alf.
Right.
Because obviously she's had a nightmare 18 months or whatever it was without him
Yeah.
around. She wants a divorce. Alf says no. Julia then meets another guy called John Dykins, and they fall in love, and she decides they want to get married. Asks Alf again for a divorce,
Yeah.
and Alf says no. So what Julia
As they
decides to
could
do,
back then.
well, yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah.
So again, with back then, you didn't live together in sin. You lived together because you got married.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
Julia was a rebel. She wanted to live with John Dykins, and Alf not giving a divorce wasn't going to stop that. So
Right.
they set up home together. Problem is, they could only afford the one-bedroom flat, which has one bed. Unfortunately, that means 5-year-old John is sharing a bed with his mum and his mum's boyfriend. That's not good.
Not ideal.
No. Now,
No.
again, the original stories where the Aunt Mimi, Julia's oldest sister, who told most of the John stories for years and years, would
What
say,
age
"Oh,
was John at this time?
5,
5.
5 years
Right.
old." So he sort of had not really had his dad around for much of his life, but he's been with his mum, and they've moved houses a couple of times. So Mimi had told the story that she loved John from when he was born. She ran through the streets dodging the bombs because of course Liverpool was the second most bombed
Oh
British
yeah,
city during the war.
blitzed.
Yeah, and our worst blitz was May 41, but so at the end of 1940 there were bombs falling. So Mimi talks about, John's born 9th of October 1940. She runs through the streets because she wants to see the baby, dodging the bombs. Problem was there was no bombs dropped when John was born. That's the kind of research we can find out, but it makes a good
Wow.
story.
Yeah.
And she fell in love with John as a baby. Also not true. Mimi didn't like babies or children, which is why she didn't have any of her own. She then says she disapproved of what Julia was doing and had John removed from Julia to take to live with her. Another good spin on a story, what I found out actually it was their father, John's grandfather, Pop Stanley.
Right.
He's the one who got child's social services involved.
Right.
Has John removed from his mother and turns to Mimi, the oldest of the 5 daughters, and says, "You've got no children. You're taking John to
So
live with you.
so he was turned over to the father, and then the father goes to Mimi and says, "You want to
You're
take
taking
over?"
him." Yep.
Yep.
So from the age of 5, John then lives with his Aunt Mimi and Uncle George. Now, Mimi wasn't maternal.
No.
That wasn't her way of connecting. She couldn't do that with a child. Her husband George was very paternal. So Uncle George becomes John's father figure,
Yeah.
and he's a lovely, lovely man. Everybody I've spoken to said, "Well, a lovely man." They had a great relationship. George helped John learn to read. Um, he was the one who wired the speaker into his bedroom so he could listen to the radio, stuff like that. They had a great relationship. But that then becomes one of the other tragedies because when John's 14, his Uncle George dropped dead very suddenly.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah, so that was tricky. And at that point, he hadn't seen his mum very much because the family had decided it wouldn't be good for him to see too much of his mum. Now,
Well,
by the time,
what was she getting up to? Was it just because she was in this relationship, or was there anything else in the background?
no, nothing else. And by this time, she's moved into a house with her partner, John Dykins. They're living as husband and wife. They then have 2 daughters, Julia and Jackie,
Right.
who John would see occasionally. So he's got 2 half sisters he was growing up with.
Right.
And then at about the age of 13, one of his cousins came down from Scotland again. So you keep getting all these mentions. Yeah, they lived in Edinburgh. I don't want to
Right.
get into rivalry, so they came down from
Oh no.
Edinburgh, and his cousin said, "I know where your mum lives. Do you want to come and see?" So his cousin Stan takes John to his mum's house. It's only about a mile away from where he was living, and he reconnects with his mum.
Right.
And because of that age, Mimi can't do anything to stop it. And Julia then becomes a huge influence on John because she's very musical. She had a good singing voice. She played the banjo, played a bit of piano as well. And so she actually buys John his first guitar and
Right.
she teaches him to play it. But because she could only play banjo, he would only tune 4 strings on his guitar like a banjo and play banjo chords.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Didn't know that.
when so when he started the Quarrymen, there's
Yeah.
John on guitar, played like a banjo. Eric Griffiths on guitar, also tuned and played like a banjo. Plus Rod Davis on a banjo. But that was the thing
3
about
banjos,
Skiffle.
basically.
Yeah, but that's what Skiffle was all about. It's like
Just
you
do
got
what
an
you
instrument,
can, sort of
you
thing.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rod Davis, because they were all at Quarrybank School. That's where they get the Quarrymen name from. Rod had bought a banjo over the weekend from his uncle in Wales. Comes into school on the Monday to his friend Eric and says, "I've got a banjo." And Eric says, "Great, you're in the group." "I can't play it. Doesn't matter. You're in."
And so
That's what.
that's how the Quarrymen start.
That's how they start. It's a group of friends at school, because you didn't need to be great musicians to play skiffle. You
No.
learn 3 chords, and you've got all these songs you can play, and you just have fun. And that was the great thing about skiffle, was that it was fun. It was about kids
Yep.
picking up musical instruments and just having the fun with it. It was great stuff. So that's how they started. So John has reconnected with his mum. She lets the Quarrymen rehearse at her house. she would join in with the rehearsals sometimes on a banjo, and she becomes this big influence going to see the Quarrymen perform. And then tragedy then strikes John because his mum gets knocked down and killed by a
Right.
car when John's 17.
17.
Yeah. So that thing, that connection with Paul and John, is that 1956, Paul loses his mum. 1957 meets John. 1958, John loses his mum.
Jeez.
And
Tragedy just follows them, doesn't it?
yeah, it does absolutely. But they had something that connected them. They never really had to talk about it because
Yeah.
your lads, you don't talk about these things, but they understood each other. They knew
Yeah.
what each other
They
was
had that
going through.
connection.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Julia is the musical influence for John, just like Jim
For
had been
John.
for
For
Paul.
Paul.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was a complicated life, but he got there on guitar.
So obviously they've been rehearsing and stuff like that in the house and probably get quite good, no doubt. So when did they start gigging then?
So as far as the closest we can get to, we're pretty sure it's June 1956 that
Right.
the Quarrymen start practicing. The lineup changes a few times over the next few months. The first proper performance then is around, it's either October or November 1956, and they play the school dance at Quarrybank School. So they're
Right.
playing on the stage at their school, and they're only playing for about 15 minutes. But that's the first time they perform. And then they start performing in other places. I mean, the Cavern Club opens in January 57 as a jazz club. But within a couple of months, the Quarrymen are playing at the Cavern.
Right. So they played at the Cavern as the Quarrymen first. I
Oh,
didn't
yeah,
know
yeah.
that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it
Wow.
was, they didn't play as the Beatles until February 61.
God,
It's
it's
a
quite a
long,
while then, eh?
it is, yeah. I mean, the Cavern didn't start accepting beat music till they toyed with it till about May 1960. Didn't really
Right.
fully embrace it till 61. They kept on as being a jazz club. But because skiffle had come out of jazz because of Lonnie Donegan, skiffle was okay at the Cavern under
Right.
the strict instructions that you didn't play rock and roll. Now, it's not going to be hard to make this
At the,
leap, but you tell John Lennon you can't do something. What's
oh,
John Lennon going to do?
well, exactly.
So he
Exactly.
says, here's one of our favourite skiffle songs, Blue
Red
Suede Shoes.
red rag to a bull.
It was exactly. So the note gets passed up, cut out the rock and roll. Otherwise, they deduct it from your fee.
No,
So
so
that's
they
when you,
oh right, on you go, sir.
yeah, I can say that. So that by early '57, they're starting to now play, and quite often it'd be for free, for
Right.
just for the experience of playing. But sometimes then they would be paid a little bit, not a lot, but they're doing it for fun.
Not a lot. Yeah. So then they go to this place called the Casbah Coffee Club.
Ah,
Eh,
yeah.
Now I'm really interested in the Casbah Coffee Club. I think I'm going to go there later this year.
Oh, good.
It's it looks amazing inside and stuff like that. So
Yep.
now there's a funny story. I believe is it Pete Best's mum who owned it. Is that right?
Yep.
Tell us a bit about the Casbah
Yep. Well, to do the leap in history, just so you got it um,
order.
in
Yeah.
chronological order. So John and Paul meet 6th of July 57.
Right.
So Paul then joins the Quarrymen. They realise as they're starting to do more rock and roll that they need a lead guitarist, which Paul can't do that. He froze on stage at one gig trying to do that and said, I can't do this, but I know a lad who can. There's a guy he'd met on the school bus called George Harrison.
Right.
So Paul introduces George to John. Now, this
Well,
is
wait a
one of
minute. How did Paul and John meet?
that's a
We never established that
no,
yet.
no, that's one of the biggest coincidences ever. Um, so the book that I've just published, which is the thing behind me, the Beatles What If, is all those moments in Beatles history where things could have worked out differently.
Yeah.
This all started when I found
What
out
if?
how John and Paul met. John had a terrible reputation among the parents of Woolton where he lived. He was known as that Lennon.
Yeah.
All the lads were told, don't hang around with that Lennon, he's trouble. It didn't stop them, but they were told that. So there's a lad called Ivan Vaughan who's in the year behind John at Dovedale School. When he gets ready to go to high school, he should have gone to Quarry Bank, where John and his friends
Right.
were. But Ivan's parents didn't want Ivan in the same school as that Lennon. That's how
Right.
big a distraction he would have been.
How,
So
what did
instead,
he get up to?
it's mainly mischief, but he was a nightmare for teachers because he got
Torag,
bored.
as they say.
Oh, an absolute Torag. There's you can see that like the detention books, and John was always in detention.
Really?
Um, yeah, and
You,
apparently,
that's how much research this guy has done. He's
yeah,
went into John Lennon's detention records.
oh yeah, and there's there's one I've just looked at. It's like over like a 2 week period, and it's like there's talking in class, chewing in class, talking in class, chewing in class again, and then there's one. It just says sabotage. I want to know
Wonder what that.
what
What
has
was
he
that?
done for a teacher to write sabotage
He
in to
probably
put him in
fed up being in
detention?
detention and he's messed about with the teacher's chair or something, so it fell when he sat on it or something.
It could have been absolutely anything. Still don't know that one. But apparently he's the only lad who got put in detention while he was already in detention. Now that's a class act.
Oh,
So, but
what
so
a boy.
he was an absolute nightmare for teachers. So Ivan's not allowed to go to the same school as John. So
Right,
instead, they send him to another high school in Liverpool city centre, like a half-hour bus ride away. He ends up in the class with the lad born on exactly the same day as him, which is the 18th of June, 1942, whose name was Paul McCartney.
right.
Ivan then becomes friends with Paul. He's still best mates with John. It's Ivan who brings Paul to meet John when the
Wow.
Quarrymen are performing in Wilton.
So no Ivan, no Beatles.
Correct. Absolutely right. He's the only connection between the two because
Wow.
John and Paul lived in different parts of Liverpool, went to different schools, different groups of friends. There's no reason the two of them should meet if it
Ever
wasn't
meet?
for
They'd
Ivan.
never have met.
No.
Wow.
So that's how John and Paul meet. And then within 5 months, most of the lads who are in the Quarrymen on the day John and Paul meet are out of the group. And
Right,
George has joined. Now, we were always told that George joined around February 1958. Now, in discussions with Rod Davis from the Quarrymen, he's like the Quarrymen historian, that didn't make sense. So I got a copy of Eric Griffith's Merchant Navy records. Right? And this will make sense, honestly, trust me. So when George joins, Eric is pushed out.
right,
But from Eric's Merchant Navy records, he joins his first ship somewhere around the 12th or 13th of February 1958.
right.
He qualified in January 58. So he must have
So it'd
signed
have
up
to be,
in
yeah,
December 57. Therefore, George must have joined in December 57, not February 58.
right.
And
There
then
you go.
we know the venue is Wilson Hall, and the Quarrymen played there on the 7th of December 1957. That
And
must
that
have
would have
been
been
the day.
with George. Yep.
Yeah. So that's when, after that gig, George does his audition for John, and we know he did at least two auditions because John was 17, George was 14.
Yeah.
That's a
Big
big
age
gap.
gap at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
But George just blew him away because he's so good on guitar. But George gets to join. So by the time
Yeah.
you get into 1958, John, Paul, and George are together,
Right.
and that's the core
58.
of the Beatles. Yeah. So going through 58, um, it's John, Paul, George, Colin, the original drummer, is still there, and then sometimes one of Paul's school friends, John Duffalo, played on piano. So there's the
Right.
five of them playing. 12th of July 58, they make a record. Now this has become the rarest and most important disc in the world, which thankfully had been kept. And it's just one of these, they recorded it live straight to disc and only made one
Right.
copy. And it was actually John Duffalo had looked after it for years and years. And so we have that. It's a Paul McCartney song, In Spite of All the Danger. And the other side is
Have a
That'll
good.
Be the Day
Yep.
by Buddy Holly, their hero. So they make that record on the 12th of July, 58. 3 days later is when John's mum is killed.
Wow.
And so he loses interest in music for a bit. And really, then they're not performing much in the rest of 58. Last time they perform in 59 is about the March 59. Disastrous audition. At the end of it, Colin Hanson, the original drummer, he quits. He was 2 years older than John, was already working. And he said, why am I dragging my drums around on a bus for a few shillings? It doesn't make sense. So he quits. And all the other skiffle groups have become rock and roll groups. The Quarrymen went the complete opposite way. They go from a big skiffle group to 3 guitars. And
Right.
nobody wants to book a group with 3 guitars. So that was it. They
No
were
drummer.
no drummer, no gigs.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
George goes off and joins another group called the Les Stewart Quartet
Right.
because he just wants to play in a band.
Wants to play, yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's all
with
he wants to do.
anybody. Doesn't matter who it is.
Exactly. So he goes and plays with this other band. Now this is when Mona Best comes into it and the Casbah.
Right.
So Mona Best sees a TV program in July '59 called Look at Life, and it's featuring the Two Eyes Coffee Bar in London. It's got a little coffee bar, little stage with a group playing, and she thinks, "Oh, isn't that great fun? I'm going to turn the basement of my house into a coffee bar," as you do.
Yeah.
Mona Best was unlike anybody. She was an incredible lady. So she turns the
Just
basement
stop
into
you
a
a
house.
second.
Go
Yeah. Talk about how she got the house in the first place.
on. Okay, yeah, yeah.
This is a brilliant story. You're going to
Okay,
love it.
it's amazing. So Mona is born out in India.
Right.
Her dad was an Irishman. He was in the army out there. So she'd been born out there and grew up there. Meets John Best out there, who was a PT instructor for the army.
Yeah.
They get married, come back to Liverpool, and they got 2 boys, Pete and Rory. She wants to live in a big house like she had done in India. And John Best, the husband, keeps saying no to everything they look at. And so, because she likes to fluster on the horses, she decides to bet on the English Derby. And there's a horse there called Never Say Die. Absolute rank outsider, ridden by a jockey nobody really heard of called Lester Piggott. Of course, becomes
Yep.
one of our
Becomes
most
a
famous ever.
champion jockey.
Yeah.
Yep.
She pawns her jewelry, puts some money down, and it's illegal. Bookmakers back then as well.
Right.
It's still illegal back then.
It was
So
still illegal in the UK.
it was still illegal. Yeah, yeah. Back then it was. So she puts the bet on, and of course the horse romps in. She suddenly got enough money, and ignoring her husband, she goes and buys this house, and it's a huge, huge place, like
I
15
believe
rooms.
it was an old conservative club or
Yeah,
something. Was
yeah,
that
it'd been
right?
a conservative club. Yeah, which it had a license, so it's like it had operated as
Yeah.
a venue anyway.
Yep.
So she's in there, sees this TV program, thinks I'm going to turn the basement into a coffee bar, and the husband says, "Over my dead body." Well, the next day she steps over his dead body and starts turning this. Nobody said no
Yeah.
to Mona, right?
No.
And she starts
Character.
turning it. Yeah. So she's getting the basement ready, and she needs a group. Well, there's this group playing in the community hall at the bottom of her road, and this group are called the Les Stewart Quartet,
Right.
who have a guitarist called George Harrison. Another coincidence. So Mona says, "Will you be the resident group?" Yes, of course we will. To open the club at the end of August '59. That's not how Beatles history goes. About 2 weeks before the club's due to open, there's a big argument within the Les Stewart Quartet. One of the guitarists, Ken Brown, had been helping Mona get the club ready, and he'd missed rehearsals. So I managed to interview Ken. I said, what had happened? And he said, well, Les suddenly freaks out, saying, I'm missing rehearsals. But I'm saying, I'm getting the club ready for us. And Les says, I don't care. That's it. We're not going to play. So Ken says, fine, I quit. So George says, well, if you quit, I quit. The two of them go up to see Mona and say, look, this is what's gone on. He doesn't want to play, but the two of us will play. Thanks for your honesty, lads, but I need more than just the two of you. If you can get some more musicians, fair enough. Ken doesn't know anybody else. And George says, well, I used to be in this
I know a
group.
couple of lads.
I know a couple of lads. And as George goes to John and Paul and reforms the Quarrymen to open the Casbah.
Open the Casbah. See, I think a lot of people worldwide have heard of the Cavern. Not a lot of people understand how monumental the Casbah Club was to the Beatles.
Exactly right. And Paul McCartney said in an interview, people know about the Cavern and those places,
Yep.
but the Casbah is where it's all started.
Absolutely.
And this Steve Bodley, we helped to paint it.
That's
And
right. They painted it, didn't they?
yeah,
A few times.
Yeah,
They made do it again, didn't
yeah, it was John. Typical, typical John. Because it's school holidays, so George
they? Yeah.
introduced them to Mona. He says, this is my friends John and Paul." And she says, "Can any of you paint?" John says, "I'm at our college. Great, here's a tin of paint and a brush. Get painting."
I've seen some of his paintings.
Yeah. Well, that's what he did at first. And she says, "There's no way that is going up in my club. Paint over it." So then he paints over that in green paint, and she hated the color green. She's quite
Right.
superstitious.
Oh, yeah, Irish.
Yeah. So he said, "Right, okay, you're painting over that." So he then paints it a third time and does this sort of Aztec design. So you've got this huge ceiling, hand painted by John Lennon 3 times, which literally you can put your hand up and touch because it's all been
Wow.
preserved. You've got another little ceiling that Paul painted. You can reach up and touch it. There's nowhere like it for Beatles fans
No.
because this is the birthplace of the Beatles, the
Yeah.
Casbah.
You'd probably think that painting on that ceiling is probably the biggest John Lennon painting that there
Oh yeah,
is in the world still
absolutely.
surviving, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
absolutely.
truly amazing. You can actually go there. You probably. I've not been myself, and I'm going to be going this year. But yeah, basically, there's a bit where John Lennon's actually inscribed in the ceiling, and it's just there. It's just
Yeah,
there. It's unbelievable,
yeah, and on the wall, it's got him into
right?
trouble with Mona. He'd finished doing his painting, thought, "I'm going to autograph this."
Sign it,
So he gets as far as John. Mona turns up, back of the head, smacks him. "What are you doing to my lovely new paintwork?" So
right?
he
So,
got
what
into
sort of
trouble for that.
stuff are they playing in there at that time? Then, so what kind of songs were they playing as the Quarrymen in there?
So 59 really, um, a few leftovers of skiffle, but
Right,
really, because if you think of 56 is the year that changes everything. So you've got Donegan Rock Island Line,
right.
but soon after that, Long Tall Sally, Little Richard, and Heartbreak Hotel from Elvis. And
Yep.
suddenly Lonnie Donegan looks nothing like Elvis and sounds nothing like Little
Yeah,
Richard. So that's why that sort of was in the past and rock and roll took over and they loved their rock and roll.
that's the latest thing. Yeah,
Yeah. And so that's a lot they were doing. So John, for the first time in his life, actually went and got a job. That summer he worked on a building site, basically just making cups of tea for people, not doing very much else. But with the cash, he could put a down payment to buy his first electric guitar.
right.
So when they open the Casbah, John is playing his brand new electric guitar. Now, the first stage, and you'll see it when you go there, literally, you can stand there, put your hands out to your sides, and you can touch either wall. That's how small it was. So there was 4 of them, John, Paul, George, and Ken, all playing guitars. There's only room for one person to stand. And you had to be careful because if you you would swing the neck of the guitar, you take somebody's eye out. So it's this really little stage, but that then becomes the most important venue because when they then are the Beatles going to Hamburg 12 months later, that's when Pete Best becomes the drummer.
Yeah,
And after Hamburg, that's where that becomes their base.
yeah. So, how many people would the Casbah hold? How many people would you get in there?
I would say probably about 200 at a
200.
squeeze. And I've been in there at a squeeze a few times
Yeah,
because every year at our International Beatle Week in August, Pete Best Band would always play, and they'd have a number of bands on, and then the Pete Best Band would come on and play. So I've been in there a few times for that. And honestly, you're like sardines in there. You're really squashed in, and it gets so hot,
hot.
really hot and sweaty. And so Mona being very, very clever, she sold memberships. I think the end was about 3,000 members.
Yeah,
And then, if you remember, you paid a reduced amount when there was a group on.
right.
So then,
Was that?
instead
I
of
heard that was because it was so popular. The queues get too long,
yeah, it did. So what she did was
so
instead of
so she
taking
had to. Yeah.
yeah,
You,
instead of
on you
taking
go.
the money
You're the
on the
guest. You
door,
tell it. You tell.
yeah, yeah, instead of taking the
I'm
money
just
on the
too
door,
excited.
I know,
Yep.
calm down, man, calm down. All right, let's calm down, man. Uh, So instead of taking the money on the door, she goes to the
Yep.
front gate of the property, takes the money there, You then take your chances whether you get inside or not.
Right.
But because it got so hot, after a while, the crowd would have to come out for fresh air, so the next lot would go in. And
So
because it
when
was
they were
so,
taking a breather, it's
exactly,
another segment in. Yeah.
yeah. And again,
Wow.
Mona being really, really clever, because no alcohol, of course. It's tea and coffee and Coca-Cola. They end up being Coca-Cola's biggest retail outlet in the northwest of England, because the Casbah was open 7 nights a week. So Coca-Cola even delivered on a Sunday when they never did that anywhere else,
Wow.
because it was always so hot in there. And Mona being Mona, there'd be a little fire in there, and she'd keep the fire on, keep
No
everybody warm.
way. Did you?
Yes, so she'd be absolutely roasting. So they'd have to buy more cold drinks. And she had this huge American fridge. Now, not many people have fridges yet anyway.
Uh-huh.
She had this massive American fridge, and that was just stacked with Coca-Cola. So again, the original fridge is still there. Some of the promo stuff from Coca-Cola is still there. And in the coffee bar section, it's like little rooms,
Uh-huh.
there's all these stars on the ceiling. And they all had to go paint that. Stuart Sutcliffe included as well. They were all painting. Cynthia did a painting of John on the wall. All this stuff is still there.
Wow.
It's all
I
original.
can't wait to see this.
It is truly an amazing place.
Wow. So how did Pete Best end up then being a drummer for the Beatles?
Right. So
Or were they a quarrymen at that point still, or was it?
no. So what they do is they play as the Quarrymen for about 10 weeks at the Casbah.
Right.
One evening, Ken Brown wasn't feeling well, so he said to the lads, "Can you three play?" He said, "Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah, don't worry." So he sat down. I think he took ticket money or something. So John, Paul, and George play, and at the end of the night, Mona comes with their money. Is your quarter share? Is your quarter share? Here's your quarter share. And Ken, there's your quarter share. Hang on, Ken didn't play. We want Ken's money. Well, no, you're a group. He couldn't perform, but he was still here. He was still working. I pay you as a group, so you get a quarter share each. We want Ken's money. Well, you're not getting Ken's money, John. If we don't get Ken's money, we're not playing here again. Nobody took on Mona Best and won. Now
No.
she was only little, but nobody took her on
Uh-huh.
and won. So she throws them out.
So she's like, okay, then bye.
Yeah, get out. No, plenty of others. Clear off.
Yep.
So that was them out. So then they're sort of stuck. They thought, right, we're not going to be Quarrymen anymore. We're done with that. They do one performance as Johnny and the Moondogs, just in a competition in Manchester. But they think everybody else has become a rock and roll group. We've got to become a rock and roll group.
Yeah.
So they need a bass player. So they go
Yes.
to John's art school friend, Stu Sutcliffe. He was sharing a flat with a guy called Rod Murray. So they say to the two of them, Stu and Rod, either of you get yourself a bass guitar and you can join the group. Well, neither of them could afford it. Now, Rod is in design. So he designs his own bass guitar and starts making it out of wood.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I interviewed Rod, and he still has his
That
wooden
guitar.
for his bass. So he cut it out. Really good. But in the meantime, Stuart has a painting exhibited in a local art competition. Now, Stuart, of course, is Scottish. So I mentioned that. Born in Edinburgh.
There you go.
See, the connections are everywhere.
Edinburgh people aren't Scottish, though, is it?
Oh, yeah, I haven't said that. I want a disclaimer now. That wasn't me.
Excuse me, Liverpudlian people sometimes don't think of themselves as English.
No, that's not true. That's not sometimes.
Ah, no,
No, it's all
that's
the
all the
time.
time.
Yeah,
They're Liverpudlian first, and then English. Yeah.
absolutely. People's Republic of
Yeah.
Merseyside, this is.
Ah,
Um,
brilliant.
so our Scottish guy, Stuart, he has a painting
Stuart. Yeah.
exhibited, and John Moores, whose family set up Littlewoods Pools, he's
Right.
a local millionaire who
Wow.
pours money into both Liverpool and Everton football clubs. He buys Stuart's painting for £65, which of course was a fortune back then.
Oh, back then.
So of course, as soon as John and Paul know Stuart's got £65, Okay,
They're in
Stuart,
the money.
you're
How
going to
many
buy a bass
guitars
guitar.
would you like?
So they pin him into a corner at the Casbah Club until he agrees to buy a bass guitar. So he buys a
Right.
bass and Stuart joins. Now, mythology will tell you Stuart couldn't play bass, stood with his back to the audience, and he was there just because he was John's mate. Not true. When he first
Right.
started, he was just learning,
Yeah.
as they all were. But he soon became very proficient as a rock and roll bass player,
Right.
particularly in Hamburg. So again, myth to dispel.
Yep.
So they then need to become a rock and roll group. That happens through Alan Williams and Lord Woodbine. So they're
Right.
hanging out at the club of Jacaranda, and Alan's promoting other groups. So they say, "Can you give us some work as a group?" And Alan says, "What group?" He says, "Well, there's the four of us." And Lord Woodbine says, "Where's your drummer? We haven't got a drummer, and you're not a group." All right, Alan, can you get us a drummer? So Alan gets him a drummer called Tommy Moore, and they
Right.
first appear as a rock and roll group on the 10th of May 1960 as John, Paul,
1960.
George, Stuart, and Tommy. And they do well, and they do an audition to be a backing band for Billy Fury. Of course, was
And was that in the Jacaranda?
now that was actually in Alan's other club, the Wyvern Club, which later became the Blue Angel. So
Right.
just up the road from there.
Yeah.
So Billy Fury has become Britain's first true rock and roll idol and answer to
Yeah.
Elvis. Also from the Dingle, I'd point out, in Liverpool. His name is Ronnie Wycherley. And his first album, The Sound of Fury, is now acknowledged as the first British rock and roll album.
Rock and roll. Yep.
Yeah. So he was an absolute star. So they do the audition. But of course, they're very, very average. They've never performed before. They'd never met their drummer, Tommy Moore, before until the audition, which he turned up late at.
Did they do any rehearsing for it?
Well, John Paul George and Stuart did some rehearsing, obviously without
With
Tommy.
the drummer. With the drummer. I mean, so
No, not with the drummer. No,
no,
this was their first time with the
that
drummer.
was the first time.
Yeah. So they don't get the gig for Billy Fury, but they do get the chance to back another Liverpool singer whose stage name was Johnny Gentle. Not the
Right.
greatest rock and roll name you've ever heard.
No.
And they get to do a 2-week tour of, where's the place? North of the border, Scotland. That's it.
Oh, right, right,
So
right.
the first
Back
tour
up
they
here.
do, call themselves the Silver Beatles at this point, and they go around a few halls around Scotland for a couple of weeks. That's where they first sort of learn what it's like to be in a band on the road.
Yeah.
Now they have a car accident just outside Fraserburgh. I think Johnny Gentle was driving, and they slam into another car, and the guitar case goes flying forward and hits Tommy Moore right in the face, breaks his nose, loses some teeth, splits his lip, and he ends up in hospital. But of course, they're due to play in Fraserburgh that night.
Yeah. Wow. So what did they do?
Well, John, being the resident Florence Nightingale, goes to the hospital. There's Tommy, dizzy with concussion, grabs him out of his hospital bed and drags him and sits him behind his drum kit. Now, if you've got concussion and a banging headache, what instrument do you not want to play?
You
The
want to
drums.
play it?
Yeah. So there's
Keith
poor
Mason.
Tommy. Yeah. Oh, exactly. And he did say afterwards that John used to turn around and try and make him laugh because if he
Oh
laughed, he might
no.
burst the stitches in his lips.
Oh, unbelievable.
And
Unbelievable.
so
See, these are the kind of stories that you'd never
it's
hear.
fabulous.
You never
No,
hear these things.
so it's
That's
fantastic.
brilliant.
They get back to Liverpool, and then Tommy quits, and John says, "Why is he quit?" Uh,
Uh,
yeah. So they have
unreal.
another. They have one night where they have two guys who sit in on drums, which is a bit of a disaster. A guy called Ronnie the Ted, who was the local
Right.
Teddy Boy gang leader, and he was so big. He said, "I'll play drums." Well, the Weedy Beatles were not going to say no to him.
Oh
So
no,
said,
no.
no,
There you
play
go.
whatever you
Help
want.
yourself. Help yourself.
He sits down and bashes away at the drums all night. He's absolutely terrible. But Alan Williams gets him out of that one. They then get
Uh-huh.
another drummer called Norman Chapman.
Right.
Most people have never heard of Norman Chapman. Norman was a really, really top drummer. Really, really good guy. And he fit in straight away with the Beatles. They gone great, played a few gigs. And then through Lord Woodbine and Alan Williams, they get the gig to go to Hamburg. And
Right.
then a week before they're going to Hamburg, Norman Chapman gets an envelope. You've been called up to do national service. So he has to
Oh,
go and join the army.
so that would leave them somebody short then.
Correct. A drummer.
Yep.
So now they've got a matter of days to find a drummer. And they think, who do we know? Well, by this time, Pete Best is playing it in a group. After Ken Brown is out the Quarrymen, he forms the Blackjacks with Pete
Yep.
on drums. So Ken Brown's a really important guy. And so they've seen Pete play. And Paul said that he'd even sat in with them. Said, so we knew he was a good drummer. So Paul rings, speaks to Mona, said, do you think Pete could come to Hamburg? And Mona, again, what a lady, says, if it's fine with him, it's fine with me. Pete says yes. They do an audition on the Saturday. And as Alan Williams told me, he said, we called it an audition, but nobody else was being auditioned. He was going to get the job just so he wouldn't ask for too much money. So he does the audition on the Saturday, and Pete's brother Rory went with him, and he said, they were rubbish. He said, but I wasn't going to
Right.
tell our Pete that, but they weren't good. And they weren't particularly good at that point. On the Sunday night, they play at the Jacaranda, and that's really just a run through to go through all the songs that they
Yep.
knew. That rehearsal sort of turns into a gig and sort of becomes the first Beatles performance of a settled Beatles lineup.
Right.
On the Monday night, the following day, they're heading off to Hamburg. So Pete joins right at the last minute and they head off to Hamburg. And of course, Hamburg is where they learn to be a band. And
Yes.
really, if you don't get, and it's one of the biggest what ifs in the book,
Right.
as well as not having Alan Williams and Lord Woodbine, if they don't go to Hamburg, they don't progress like they did. They were
No.
playing 6 to 8 hours a night. And that's where you learn to be a band. And they
Absolutely. Just
became
pure
the best.
repetition.
Yeah. Learning new material. And they just developed so much that by the time they get back to Liverpool at the end of 1960, first place they play is the Casbah.
Yep.
And the builders, the Beatles, direct from Hamburg. Now, nobody in Liverpool knew who the Beatles were. They'd been the Silver Beatles for a bit.
Yep.
They never had a settled lineup. They didn't have a settled name. When they come back, they think, oh, it's a German group.
Yeah.
And then they walk in and go, hang on, that's John, Paul, and George from the Quarrymen. That's Pete Best. It's his house. And is a great little bit of trivia I found when I was doing Liverpool was Stuart Sutcliffe had stayed in Hamburg, so they needed a bass player. The guitarist from Pete's band, the Blackjacks, was a guy called Chas Newby. He gets roped in. So for those first 4 gigs in Liverpool after Hamburg, as the Beatles, Chas Newby becomes the first left-handed bass player in the Beatles. It's not
All right.
Paul.
So it's not even Paul's there you go. Wow. So when did Paul start playing bass then?
So that's out in Hamburg. So they go back to Hamburg
Right.
in April 61 and they play for 92 nights consecutively, yeah. That's when George Harrison says, I think musically as a band, that's when we were at our tightest because we were playing all the time. We just learnt our stagecraft, and it
Yeah.
was a great club, a great PA. So we just loved that, and said, and we were just untouchable at that point. So
Wow.
then, so about the end of May 61, Stu Sutcliffe, because he was a great artist,
Uh-huh.
he was
That's
wanting to
right.
do his art, so he's trying to do music and art, and that was annoying Paul because he wasn't rehearsing as much.
Right.
Stuart then gets accepted into the Hamburg Art College, which was a very rare thing for somebody outside of Germany to be accepted, but he was that talented. So before he's kicked out, in a way, Stuart quits. Well, there's only one person who can become the bass player,
Yeah.
and that's Paul. Because at that point, his guitar had broken, so he was playing piano. So he was sort of
Right.
sat behind the front of the group, side on playing the piano, and it was John, George, and Stuart who were at the front. Well, John's always going to be rhythm guitar. George was always going to be lead. Pete was always going to be drums. The only
Yeah,
person who could
absolutely.
play bass was Paul. So he takes that on, but he sort of then reinvents the role of the bass guitarist because he's a guitarist at heart. So he doesn't want to just hit the plodding bass notes. He wants to
Yes.
make it more and more
He wants
melodic.
to. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and that's what then suddenly they become a four-piece. And within a matter of weeks, they make their first record, My Bonnie,
yeah.
backing guy Tony Sheridan, and they released the record My Bonnie in October '61, but only in Germany.
Right.
And it's Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, not the
Is
Beatles.
that
Yeah.
wow? There you go.
So,
Do
so the
these
Beatles.
exist?
Oh yes, oh yes. I have my copy signed by Pete Best.
Wow.
Oh yeah. Um,
So how many copies of that did they sell?
oh, but thousands over in Germany.
Right.
Yeah, it got into, I think, got into the top 20, in fact, possibly into
In
the top
Germany?
10 in the charts. And yeah, it did
Wow.
really well. So the Beatles that are over here, they're going around telling everybody, look, we're on a record.
Yeah.
So all
We
the fans,
charted.
yeah,
Yep.
all the fans go into the music store, to the best record department, which was run by a guy called Brian Epstein.
Right.
Ah, this is how Brian comes into the picture. So all the fans are going into Brian's store and wanting a copy of the record.
Yep.
So Brian tracks down the record to Germany, imports about 25 copies, and they sell out straight away. So he imports another load, advertises them for sale, and they're selling out. So it's a group he's reading about in the local music paper, Mersey Beat. There are fans coming in and asking for a record. So this is a Liverpool group who are obviously very, very popular and are selling records. So Brian says, where do they play? At the Cavern. Now, ironically, the Cavern was a 5-minute walk from Brian's store, but he'd never go to a place like the Cavern. He had no idea it was
You'd
that close.
never gone to a club even though you had a record store?
No, no, that
No?
wasn't his style of music.
No.
So he goes down there with his PA, Alistair Taylor, and again, I interviewed Alistair Taylor many years ago to talk about that day, and they go down. So it's 9th of November 1961, and there's the Beatles on stage. So it's the four of them, John, Paul, George, and Pete, in their black leathers. It's a
Oh, yeah, of
lunchtime,
course. Yep.
and I mean they're rowdy. They're smoking, they're eating, they're drinking, they're clowning around. And Alistair said when he saw them, he said the noise was horrendous. That they were absolutely terrible, but they were absolutely brilliant. So it wasn't our style of music. So, but whatever that ingredient is, whether it is the X factor, whatever it is, said they
Stage
had it.
presence.
Oh, they had it absolutely.
Yeah.
And the key thing that Alistair told me was during the set they played one of their own songs, "Hello, Little Girl,"
Right.
and Brian had a very good ear for what would make a hit record, and he thought, so they've written that song, that could be a hit record. That's a really good song. That is why Brian wanted to sign them. He thought if they can
Right.
write their own songs, they can make records. I know how to sell records.
So how many songs did they have of their own at that point then? So they were doing mostly covers then, I
Yeah, it's
take it?
basically all covers. But the problem was because there were so many bands in Liverpool, everybody, if you're doing covers, is sort of doing the same stuff.
Same as everybody else. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you'd have to do is your own arrangement of a song. And of course, they learned all that in Hamburg because most songs lasted between 2 and 2.5 minutes. If you've
Uh-huh.
got hours to fill, that's a lot of songs, unless you learn to make them last for 10 or 15 minutes.
Right.
So they
So they
learn
were
to,
padding them out.
absolutely right. So they're doing their own arrangements. But then even that was getting copied. So they thought, well, if we write our own stuff and perform that, nobody's going to perform our songs. So they start reintroducing
Right.
songs that they'd written into their set. So they hadn't really performed their own stuff in a long time, but they've been writing consistently. Even when John and Paul meet in July '57, one of the things that connected was the fact they both tried writing
Both
songs
wrote
at that point,
songs. Yep.
and they'd never found anybody else who's a songwriter. So by the end of '61, they're starting to introduce a few more of their own songs into their set. And that's how Brian then offers to be their manager. And it's only through Brian that they get out of Liverpool because he's got the contacts in the record companies.
Right. So did Brian, as the manager, signs a contract with them? Did he sign them up basically?
He did, but he didn't sign the contract.
Just a shake of the hand sort of thing?
No, no, they all
Or
signed it. They signed it. Alistair signed it. But it's only when a few years ago I interviewed Brian Epstein's lawyer and I said,
right.
why didn't Brian sign it? He said, well, under UK law, if you were 21 and you signed a contract with somebody, you were legally bound to that contract. John was 21 by that time. If Brian had signed it and didn't get them a record deal, John was still contractually signed to Brian.
Right.
So Brian deliberately didn't sign the contract, didn't have the parents' details of those under 21 inserted into the contract, so that if he failed to do what he was trying to do, the
You
Beatles
could
could
get
walk
out.
away. He was
Uh-huh.
completely fair, open, and honest with them. But
So if you were under 21, you couldn't legally sign a contract. Is that
no,
what you're saying?
you have to get a parent to sign for
So
you.
what age would have George have been at that point then?
Well, George, he's still a kid. I mean, he's only what
I
was he
know.
born in 43?
Yeah,
So he's only sort of, what was he, 19,
19.
heading up for 18, 19.
So do you think it was a
So
case
still,
he was withholding it until they were 21 and then he could sign it and say
no, no,
no,
he literally, what Brian wanted to do was that they could walk away if he failed at what he
they could
did.
walk away if they failed?
Yeah.
Right.
But it meant because they had signed it, they could enforce the contract on Brian to do what he promised to do,
Oh,
but
because they signed it.
he
Yeah,
couldn't
got it.
enforce it on them.
It's a one-way thing.
Yep, yep. So he was
Yeah,
a
there you
decent
go.
guy, was Brian. And of course, he's the
Absolutely.
guy who gets them the record contract.
Yeah. So I take it, so he then gets some tapes made up, some recordings made up, and he starts touting them about to different record companies. Who
He did
who,
every single
who
one of
did he
them.
take it to first?
They got an audition at Decca
Right,
on the 1st of January, 62. So within a matter of weeks, they
right.
got an audition down at Decca Records. And the only reason they got it, the tape he'd sent down was not good. And they
No,
were just going to reject it. But there was a Liverpool guy working for them called Tony Barrow. He ends up working for the Beatles, writes the sleeve notes on the albums and press releases and stuff. He said, do you know who Brian Epstein is? No. He's part of NEMS. Oh, NEMS had 9 stores across Liverpool for one of the biggest record retailers in the Northwest.
big
So he
clout.
thought, yeah. So therefore, we better offer his band an audition.
I
And that's how
see.
they get the audition,
So
which
it
they
was out of
claim.
respect for the stores and the amount of influence that they had.
Absolutely.
Right.
So the audition is not particularly good, and Decca turns them down. But the good thing they did was they gave Brian the tapes of the audition,
Right.
so he could then take it to other companies. Every record company turned them down.
So
But there's
what was the reason Decca turned them down then? So did they just say sorry, not for us?
yeah, he said Dick Rowe, and he's gone down in history as the top guy at Decca, said to Brian,
Yeah.
"Go back to selling records, Brian. Groups with guitars are on the way out." The problem is when you
So,
go back and you look at the charts, groups with
uh-huh.
guitars hadn't arrived yet, apart from the Shadows.
Right.
So he was just trying to find an excuse, and not a
Right.
particularly good one.
Do you think they just didn't get them?
Yeah, well, Mike Smith, who was producing the audition, he'd actually come up to Liverpool, gone to the Cavern and seen them perform, and thought they
Uh-huh.
were absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
So then he wanted them to recreate that in the
Got
audition.
you.
But the problem was it was New Year's Day, and if you've seen any of the
Oh,
pictures from London New Year's Eve,
yeah.
the Beatles and everybody are still partying in Trafalgar Square in the small hours. They
So
turn up late,
right.
a little bit hungover. Mike Smith, the producer, turns up even later and hungover. And here they are in this big recording studio, which is really designed for an orchestra. And you've got this little 4-piece band for the first time ever in a proper recording studio. And as Paul said, the red light went on. So, and I just got the screaming heebie-jeebies. And I just panicked.
Froze.
froze completely, and they weren't good. But if Mike Smith had gone with his instinct and he picked out, hang on, there's a few original songs in there, and musically you can tell they can play well. There's something to work with. But the problem was, because they were from this weird place near outer space called Liverpool, which being all of 200 miles from London, it was another world. So instead, they signed a local group, Brian Poole and the Tremolos, who were just down the road, and they miss out.
So I take it then, does he take the tapes that they got from Decca and takes them to EMI, or is that what happens there?
It's sort of a convoluted way. Again, it's all these amazing
What
little
ifs?
coincidences.
Yeah.
Everybody's turned them down. Now, Brian had met the manager of the HMV store in London at one of these record company fairs, ironically out in Hamburg.
Right.
And we know Brian was out in Hamburg at the same time the Beatles were out in Hamburg in '61. No record of the meeting, but they were actually in the same city. So Brian goes to his friend at HMV and says, look, what can I do? Where do you think I should go? And he says, well, the first thing is A&R people at record companies want acetates, not tapes. You need to get some of those tapes onto acetates. How do I do that? Well, on the next floor up is a guy who does that. I'll introduce you to him. So he goes up to the next floor, speaks to this guy, Jim Foy, and he starts to put some of the tapes onto acetate. And he says, oh, these are quite good. Who's this? He tells him it's his group. He said, but I can't get a recording contract. I said, I'm trying to find a company who will take them on because they write their own material. And he said, what you need is a song publisher. Yeah, but I don't know any. Okay. On the next floor up above me is a song publisher called Ardmore and Beechwood. And they're part of the EMI group. So they take the acetates then up there. And Sid Coleman, who's the main guy, says, okay, it's original material. Okay, if you can get a record company to release these, we'd be interested in being the publishers.
Right.
Do you know anybody? He said, well, there's a guy at EMI who's looking for a beat group. His name's George Martin. I'll fix you up with an appointment. So Sid Coleman fixes up an appointment for Brian to go and meet George Martin. So they end up in front of each other. And George Martin's not that impressed with what he hears. But he said,
yeah,
Brian
I
was
heard
such,
that.
yeah, Brian was such an earnest young man. He believed in his group, and I liked him. And I thought, what harm's it going to do if I give them an audition? Bring them down for a day, stick them in the studio, see what happens. And that's what he does. So he invites them down, 6th of June, '62. They do the audition. It's not brilliant. But when they're doing Love Me Do, John, of course, is playing his harmonica. Now, the harmonica was in, and one of the guys overseeing it runs down, gets George Martin, says, come and listen to this. And it's the harmonica sound. So he thought, okay, there's something there.
Something in that.
There's something that said, okay, I might give you a contract. Let me have a think about it. He said, but if I do give you a contract, your drummer can't do what I want him to do in the studio. Doesn't matter what you do with him as a group. But I'll just bring in a session drummer. Now, that was normal practice back then.
Yep. Yeah.
But
Totally.
Brian sold records. He didn't know that happened. So he tells John, Paul, and George, if we get a contract, then he doesn't think Pete's good enough to play on the record. And I think, okay, if we get the contract, we're going to have to change our drummer.
Yeah.
And that's what they do.
It was a total misunderstanding then.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
you have no idea. So when they first go into, they next go in the studio, which is the 4th of September, George Martin's expecting Pete Best to walk in with him. And who's this guy? Oh, this is Ringo. We changed our drummer. I said, okay, let's give him a go. Listen to him. Said, no, I still can't do what I want. I'm still going to use a session drummer.
So how could he have fired them? I mean, I don't think they had a contract at the time, did they?
Right, sit back and relax for this one. I'm going to take a swig of water, and I'll tell you.
I'll have a bit of tea. I swear to God, it's tea. It's definitely tea.
Of course it is. Yeah. See, mine's in the bottle. You can tell it's a clear liquid. You can't even tell with yours. It's in a mug. Secret drinker. I know. So what I found was, um, after the Fab 104 book, the next book I did was Finding the Fourth Beatle, which was the
Right.
story of all the drummers. So starting with
Yes.
Colin Hanson in 1956, ended up in 1970. Thought I'll go and find out how many drummers. So all these people like Tommy Moore and Norman Chapman were in that book, the Fab 104. So I had 12 drummers in that book. So out of that then comes the next book, Defining the Fourth Beatle. And I just kept finding more and more drummers. So in the end, the book was the story of 23 drummers between
Right.
1956 and 1970. And they had to play with the group either at a gig or on record. So I had 23 drummers. Now, that isn't actually accurate because I found 3 more. So I'm up to 26 drummers different times.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, where were we? Back to drummers.
Back to drummers.
Back to drummers. So it then becomes all about the drummers.
Yeah.
So Andy White ends up as the guy who replaces Ringo. But replacing Pete, George Martin didn't
Uh-huh.
envisage him changing the live group. But they
No.
thought, if the most important guy, George Martin, says he's not up to it, and we're going to be a band who now makes records, we've got to get a drummer who can play on records. Now,
Yeah.
mythology will tell you they all love Ringo Starr and be looking for an excuse to get rid of Pete so they could bring Ringo in.
Yeah, that's the story. The official, is that the official line?
Yeah, not true. There's no evidence for that at all.
No.
Because 4 drummers were asked. 3 said no, Ringo said yes.
Right. Fourth
So the
choice.
first guy they asked was Bobby Graham. He was a top session drummer, and he was playing with Joe Brown and the Brothers, who just had a #1 hit with A Picture of You on a UK tour, and the Beatles were supporting them at a gig up here.
Right.
And so he fit perfectly, plays live and plays in the studio. So Brian offers him the job, and of course, he's not going to turn that say, oh yeah, I'm going to give
No.
up my career as a session drummer, playing with the top group to join the who? What are you called?
Right.
From
He's
Liverpool.
got a good thing going. Why would he?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a flat no. So then they approach another local drummer, Richie Galvin. He, like many musicians, couldn't get on with John Lennon, so he turns him down.
Right.
And then I found an interview that Ringo gave in November '62. So this is before the famous, for any of that stuff. He tells exactly how it happened.
Right.
And he came down, met up with the Beatles on a Saturday night, was introduced to Brian, who offers him the job. Brian then telephones Ringo on the Tuesday to confirm the arrangements. Pete is then brought into the office on the Wednesday, and then Ringo starts on the Saturday.
Right.
Now, the question you asked was, why and how was Pete Best fired? And here is the conclusion I reached. Pete Best was never fired.
They just made him think he was fired.
Yeah, because they had a problem. And it's Brian's lawyer who explained it all to me. He said,
Wow.
on the UK law, the Beatles were a partnership. Now, I'd uncovered the fact I spoke to another lawyer who had actually signed the Beatles as a legal partnership, John, Paul, George, and Pete, at the end of '61. So they were a legal partnership. Under UK law, you cannot fire a partner. You have to dissolve the partnership,
Yep.
draw up the accounts, and finish
A
everything off.
new entity. Yep.
Yep. Didn't have time for that.
No.
And then again, we've been told since 1962 that Brian Epstein fired Pete Best. You can only fire somebody if you employ them.
He never employed them.
Correct.
So
We just hadn't asked the
Pete
question.
should have a quarter share then, should he not?
Well, see, this is where it goes from there. So Brian calls Pete in, and his recollection is the same as Brian's, which was the boys want you out, i.e., your partners want you out of the group, and it's already been arranged that Ringo's joining on Saturday. Now, you're Pete. What are you going to think? Well,
You're thinking, oh, that's I'm fired. That's it.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the problem was, going back to the earlier contract discussion, because the Beatles had signed the contract with Brian.
Right.
Pete
Or they
can,
thought that
yeah,
it was done
Brian
both
didn't
ways.
sign it. Yeah,
Yeah.
but Pete can enforce that on Brian to find work for him.
Right. All right. Right.
Yeah. So Brian
Because
then,
he's still under his management.
yeah. So then Brian offers Pete a role in a group called the Mersey Beats, but they were only just starting up. They were two lads, aged 15 and 16.
Uh-huh.
Pete's top drummer in the top group in Liverpool. He's not going to take that on. One of Brian's friends, Joe Flannery, a promoter, was putting a band together called Lee Curtis and the All Stars, some of the top musicians in Liverpool. So
Uh-huh.
Joe Flannery invites Pete to join Lee Curtis and the All Stars. When Pete says yes, he quits the Beatles in legal terms.
Right. So by default, sort of thing.
They basically, Brian's job was to trick Pete into thinking he was fired.
He was fired. Wow. And
He
did he
joins
never
this other
try and
group.
get any sort of
He did, but he got bad
legal
legal advice.
advice or
Yeah,
legal bad?
because a lawyer then tried to sue Brian for wrongful dismissal,
Right.
but he didn't dismiss him. So
Yeah,
Brian's
because
lawyer could just say, Max said, my client did not employ your client. And he just kept
yeah.
sending the letters back because he
Wow.
misunderstood it
He
all.
should have sued the rest of them, rest of the Beatles.
Yep,
There you go. And so
yep,
he would
that's
have
it.
had some sort of royalties from what songs was he?
Well, that's
What
just it.
songs would he have got royalties from?
None,
Maybe none.
because they hadn't made the first record yet.
Right. So even though they've maybe wrote it,
They haven't
they've not
recorded yet.
recorded it.
They don't
Yeah.
record till September. But then the biggest twist came when I interviewed a local drummer called Johnny Hutchinson. Now, Johnny Hutch was the top drummer in Liverpool, and he played with a group called the Big Three, and they were fantastic musically. So on the Wednesday that Pete's been given the bad news, Brian had said, Ringo can't join till Saturday. Can you play for the couple of gigs in between? Pete's obviously in a daze and in the meeting agrees to play. And obviously when he gets outside and thinks, hang on a sec, no, there's no way am I turning up. So the Beatles have got his drums set up and no drummer. Now the Big Three were supporting the Beatles that night over in Chester. So Brian says to Johnny Hutch, after you've done your set with the Big Three, can you sit in with the Beatles for me? He said, yeah, just swap the jacket and off you go. And so he does.
Right.
And of course, being such a top drummer, he
could
fits
fit
in
in.
really well
Yeah.
musically. Brilliant. So after the gig, Brian goes to Johnny Hutch and says, as you know, Pete's no longer in the Beatles. Would you like to be the permanent drummer in the Beatles? Now, this is after Ringo's been offered the job.
Really?
Yeah.
So he'd been offered the job, and then they're offering it to somebody else. Hmm.
So
There you
what
go.
was Ringo offered? Was
Yeah.
it, as one NEMS employee said, Ringo was taken on probation to see if it would work out? Possibly. We don't. There's no evidence. We don't know. But there's something there because after Ringo's been offered it, Johnny Hutch is then offered it. Now Johnny turns
Were
him
they?
down flat. He said, "No,
But do you
I'm not
think they
going to
might
do
have
it."
been trying to get better terms from a drummer? Don't know.
Don't know. We don't
Yeah.
know. But there must have been something in the offer to Ringo,
Yeah.
which meant
That they
another
weren't
drummer.
keen on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't know. Now George had become friendly with Ringo. John and Paul knew them. They knew Ringo from Hamburg at the end of '60, but George had become particularly good friends. So George was pushing for Ringo to join.
Yeah.
So of course Johnny Hutch turns him down. So on the Saturday, 18th of August '62, Ringo makes his debut. Now, the one thing I will say is that the book Defining the Fourth Beatle is the story of all the drummers, but why does Ringo then become the drummer? And is he a great drummer? Is he the right fit, etc.? And of course, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
It would never have worked with anybody else apart from Ringo. He was such a talented
Right.
drummer. And because he'd started learning drums back in '57, he started when there was skiffle. He liked country. He liked jazz. He played with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, and they played summer seasons at Butlins,
Right.
which were a big thing. So you had
Oh,
to learn to
massive.
entertain a whole age group. So he knew so many different musical styles.
Right.
But because, and the way I look at it is, as Pete leaves, that's the end of the Beatles. They've been together 2 years. They become the best covers band that anybody had ever seen.
Yeah.
And as John said, if you didn't see the Beatles in the black leathers in Liverpool and Hamburg, you never saw the real Beatles. Because
So
live, they were phenomenal.
he considers that the best of the Beatles at that
Yeah,
point.
because they were playing straight rock.
Right.
But of course, they're now becoming a pop group, making records.
Right.
It's a
I
different. So
see.
I see it as a different band
Yeah.
altogether. That's the end
Yeah.
of the Beatles and beginning of the
Commercial.
Fab Four. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
There
it's
you
a
go.
different group. And if you look at them then as two separate groups, then
Uh-huh.
what a lot of Beatles fans struggle with is trying to give credit to Pete Best. Say, oh, he must have been a
Yeah.
crap drummer. Well, no, if he
No.
was a crap drummer, he would not have lasted 2 years with musicians of the caliber of John, Paul, and George.
No. No.
I know the first band I was in, um, our drummer was my mate from school, but he couldn't keep time.
Right.
So you can't survive. And I've spoken to so many
No.
different musicians, and I say the same thing. If your drummer can't keep time, isn't up to scratch, how long do they last? A couple of weeks. Yeah. You do not last for 2 years in the top band. It's like, and then suddenly in June '62, they go, oh, John, yes, Paul, yes, George. I've just realised our drummer can't play drums. Come on,
No.
it
No.
makes no sense. It makes no
Yeah.
sense. So I
No.
say, give credit to Pete, who was an incredible drummer for what they were doing.
Absolutely.
He was absolutely brilliant. But they were becoming a new group. And if he's going to be
Yeah.
replaced, Ringo was the perfect replacement.
So
And he then
do
makes
you
it.
think they were like a because they then changed how they looked, they changed their hairstyles, or did they change
Yeah.
their hairstyles? But so some people think that the Beatles were a wee bit manufactured. Would you think?
Oh, yeah, yeah. In effect,
Yeah.
we're probably saying they're the first boy band in the
Right.
terms of they've been put together and their image has been manufactured. Again, this is down to
Uh-huh.
Brian's skill. Brian was a lover of the theatre. And
Uh-huh.
so he saw them as a musical act. Hence the
Max
reason.
Show.
Yeah. He got them into their stage costumes, outer leathers into suits to make them commercially presentable to London and the media.
Right.
Haircuts, perfect. Make sure
Yeah.
nice and short. In the suits, bow at the end of the songs like you do in a stage play.
Right.
It's
So
all
did he get them
theatrical.
to do that?
Yeah, that's all Brian's
Yeah.
influence. Brian had complete control over everything. So people
Right.
like Simon Cowell, who've made a
Yeah.
career in music by doing,
Uh-huh.
they learned what they learned from Brian
Right.
because Brian was the first guy to do this on a global scale.
Yeah, because they became absolutely massive,
Yeah,
didn't they?
they're the biggest people on the
Massive.
planet, and
Yeah.
nobody had done anything like that before with an act.
No.
So he didn't always get it right, but
Yeah.
that doesn't matter. He still made them the biggest band on the planet, the biggest pop stars ever, and made them a
Yeah.
lot of money. And he was right.
Well, do you know one of the stats that I heard, which I found was phenomenal, is like the height of the Beatles, the amount of money that they were taking in through taxes, the British government, uh, the amount of money that they were bringing in from the Beatles was like, I think it was like a quarter of the UK
GDP.
revenue.
Yeah,
It was
yeah,
unreal,
yeah.
unbelievable. So
So
really,
then,
the
yeah,
Beatles brought the the UK back from the dead, from the war, basically helped
oh, it's
rebuild
huge,
Britain.
massive.
Yeah,
So then you have the British invasion going back over to
yeah,
America,
going over to
and
America.
and then suddenly, the BBC breaks with tradition and has a non-Queen's English speaking person, and the Liverpool accent and rural accents then become acceptable on the BBC.
Yeah, yeah,
And everything changes, and they change not just music history, but cultural history, social history.
yeah,
The fashion. Anybody who's in a band who writes and records and performs their own music, thank the Beatles
yeah.
because
There's so
nobody
many
was doing that.
firsts,
Yeah, absolutely. They were there first.
first
Still was.
stadiums.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Gatefold album. Making the album cover not just a picture of the group, but a work of art.
Right. I never even thought of that. That's
Yeah,
true. Yeah.
pop promotional videos. They made them
Yeah.
popular. First album to ever have lyrics with it was Sergeant Pepper.
So many firsts.
Yep,
So
they
how
were
did they
there.
get on in when they first went over to America? Did they
Oh, it's
uh,
huge.
who introduced America to the Beatles?
Um, so that they appear on the Ed Sullivan Show on the 9th of February 1964 in front
Right.
of 73 million people.
But they
Now,
didn't
exactly,
just like turn up and then was
uh,
their records out
yeah,
in America?
yeah.
And
By then, I mean, that is a long process in itself
right.
of how they actually get there. And it's amazing because the debut at the Cavern as the Beatles
Uh-huh.
is the 9th of February 1961. So they make
Right.
the debut there in front of a couple of hundred people. Exactly 3 years to the day later, they're in front of 73 million people on the Ed Sullivan Show. That's how quick it all went.
That's very quick, isn't it?
Yep. But their songs, George Martin was pushing Columbia, sorry, Capitol, which is part of EMI Group in America,
Yep.
and they just weren't releasing them. So the first records come out on two little labels, Swan and DJ, and they sell a little bit, but not much.
Right.
And then there's a girl called Marcy Albert. She hears "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and a copy from the UK is brought over, and she introduces it on air on a local American radio station as "I Want to Hold Your Hand." That suddenly gets played and spreads all over the country.
Yeah.
And Capitol Records are saying, "You can't play that. That's not released over here." And they're saying, "Well, this is the UK copy, so we're okay with that." Eventually, under pressure, Capitol agrees to release "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and do it an emergency pressing at the Christmas of '63. Because, of course, Beatlemania has already happened in the
Yeah.
UK.
In the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're already huge over here. Ed Sullivan's advisor in the UK has already said, look, you've got to look out for these guys. They're absolutely massive. They're going to be huge. And everything just coincides at the right time. So "I Want to Hold Your Hand" suddenly comes out for the beginning of '64 with lots of publicity. And by the time they get to the Ed Sullivan Show, "I Want to Hold Your Hand" is number one.
Right.
And there's 73 million people watching them on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Wow. And was that one of the biggest audiences for that show or whatever?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. One of
There
the
you
biggest TV
go.
audiences ever. It was huge because this Beatlemania had hit the States, and there's different thoughts on it, but because there'd been the assassination of JFK on the 22nd of November '63, America was, really everything was dark and depressed and down, and suddenly here was this group from
Yeah.
the UK
It
with
was
bright,
something
smiley, yeah, it
they
was
could
something different,
latch on to sort of thing.
yeah. And
Yeah.
ironically, on the 22nd of November in the morning, the Beatles made their first appearance on American TV on CBS News. It was a
Right.
feature all about Beatlemania over in the UK, and that story should then have been repeated in the evening. But because the assassination
But
in the afternoon,
assassination took over.
that got put to one side and wasn't then shown again for a few weeks. It's all these,
Wow.
and again, this comes back to not
What if
just plug in the new
yeah.
book, but these are
Yep.
all the scenarios that we've been looking at. Is all these different changes in Beatles history. What if it
Yeah.
doesn't work out as it had done? How could things have worked out so differently? So,
Totally,
can you
totally.
recognise? Do you know who's there on the front cover?
Yes. I can see John, Paul, George.
Yeah.
I don't know the other two.
Okay. So the guy in the middle at the front is Pete Best.
Right, so that's Pete. Looks totally
Yep.
different.
Yep. So that's what he looked like back then with
Is
his
that
quick
Stuart at
hair.
the top?
Nope.
Nope. Who's that?
That's Roy Young.
Right,
Who's Roy Young? I Hear You Cry.
exactly.
So Roy Young was Britain's answer to Little Richard. Boogie boogie piano player, great rock and roll voice. He was resident at the Star Club in Hamburg. The Beatles went over there to open the Star Club in April '62. So he played on stage with them as a five piece. and they sounded so good. Brian said, "Come back to Liverpool, come and join the Beatles."
Right.
And he said, "Well, I'm the booking manager at the Star Club. I've got a contract. It's only just opened. I can't leave that. I've got to stay here." And so he turned it down. So
Right.
it could have been the Fab Five that early.
With a pianist, there you go. There you
Yep.
go. How many people have actually claimed, or not so much claimed, but can you think of that have actually been in the Beatles and the Quarrymen? The total amount of people.
So in the book, I think I'd end up with, I think it's about 43 with the different musicians who played at different lineups with the musicians.
Right, 43.
And of course, and
Wow.
there's one more to add since that, which is me.
Yeah, I heard that. I heard that.
Yeah.
You
So
went full circle.
yeah. So I've done. It's been the weirdest experience, but it's absolutely fantastic. So from
Eh,
inviting the Quarrymen to play at Dovedale School back in 2004, and
yeah,
and becoming friends with them over the years. In April 23, I was then invited to join the Quarrymen, and so for the last 2 and a bit years, I've been playing with the Quarrymen, which is
brilliant, brilliant.
amazing. It is so much fun. So last weekend we were down in Felixstowe, and just been agreed that in August we're going to be playing at the Kaiser Keller in Hamburg, which was the
Right.
second
Does that
club
still
that the Beatles
exist?
played. Still there, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. The Indra Club, the
Wow.
first club they played, is still there. The Kaiser Keller's there, and then what was the top 10 is still there as a club. The Star Club itself, the last one they played, burned down many years ago.
Right.
But
Have you
yeah,
done the Casbah Coffee Club?
I've not played at the Casbah yet. No, so I'm looking at the Casbah
Oh,
and Cavern. I need to do, but I've played now with them. My opening first time I played with them was at Strawberry Field. Opened the new bandstand there. We played at St Peter's Church Hall where John and Paul met. We played on the stage at Quarry Bank, the very first stage the Quarrymen ever played on. So they
you
played
played
there
there?
last year.
God,
Yeah.
there you go.
So we've been playing all kinds of places. It's brilliant. Been over to Germany a number of times, going back again this year as well.
Right. And I read somewhere that you do Beatles tours as well
Yeah,
down in
yeah,
Liverpool. Is that right?
yeah. So that sort of came out of when I was researching with the book and an excuse to get out and do a bit of exercise. Um,
Yep.
so I couldn't do much for many years. I was walking with a walking stick because my mobility was shot. It's still not brilliant, but it's
Yeah.
better than it was. But I just found that I was just telling these stories, and it's through doing one of those tours that I got the publishing deal to do Liverpool because the
Right.
guy was a writer doing research, and I was telling him all these stories and said, "I've been writing about the Beatles for 20 years. I don't know half the stuff you told me." I sent him some stuff. He sent it to his publisher, and they offered me the deal. So yeah, so it's great fun. I've been out today with a family for 5 hours and just taking to all these places and just telling the stories of how the Beatles come together, and it's great fun to do.
Yeah, I could imagine. If you get the right weather.
Well, it's Liverpool. I mean, you get all 4 seasons in the same day.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well,
But
David, where can people get your books?
best thing is go to my website, which is davidabedford.com. That goes to
Right.
links for my books, my podcast, YouTube channel, to the tours, basically everything I'm involved in. I've been working as historian on a stage play, which is coming out later this year about
All
the
right.
Beatles in
Yeah.
Hamburg. Done a documentary about the Beatles in Hamburg, so that's not long come out, called No Hamburg, No Beatles, which is on Amazon, I think, at the moment. Um, Other documentaries, other projects. There's always something going on,
Yeah.
and this is all because 25 years ago, my doctor told me I
Your
had to give up
doctor.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I mean, I owed him so much. So when Liverpool came out, I gave him, a signed copy because he encouraged me so
Yeah.
much. He was absolutely brilliant, and he gave me the best advice, which was, "You've got a condition. You're going to be in pain. You can't change that. You can take tablets,
Yeah.
but you can sit at home and feel sorry for yourself, or
Yeah.
Find something to occupy your brain, because if you do that, your body can't think of pain and what you're concentrating on at the same time.
Absolutely. That's perfect.
And
Great advice, eh? Great
yep,
advice.
that's what I've done. And now I just rabbit on for hours and hours. um, what was the question?
Us- Which one? Which one was it? It's gone now.
Ah,
Well, David, thank you for being on the 60s DJ show.
absolute pleasure. It's been good fun. Thank you so much, and good questions as well. That's great.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Uh,
So, as I said, you can get David's books, and you can even organise a little tour with David over on his website. Links in the description below. So, thank you very much, David, and I'll catch you again next time. Maybe catch you again in another
in
interview.
Liverpool.
Yeah, I'll meet you at the Casbah.
Okay, you're on. I will see you there.
Okay. See
Thank
you
you.
later, David. Bye
Bye.
now. So there you have it, folks. That was David Bedford, the Beatles historian and executive producer of Looking for Lennon. So if you liked the video, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time on the 60s DJ show.